Okay, so you might be looking for a chapter 21 lecture note guideline, and there isn't one. And so the way that these biology chapters are going to work is you're just going to take notes on any old paper and submit them. They still must be complete, so I'm looking that you have all of the information you need, but there's not going to be questions and things like that for you to answer. But it is not it is a completion grade, meaning I need it to be complete. It's not just a completion grade and that you turn it in. So if you only take 5 sentences of notes, that's probably not complete and you're not going to get a full grade. The other thing you might notice is this is chapter 17, the evolution of life. And I've decided that I'm going to go ahead and use an older set of lecture notes from when I taught this course a few years ago. Just because looking at what we had last semester, I think it's too technical for the level at which you guys are expected to know. And so we're going to use these, which are more simplified, not as many words, not as many definitions, and not as technical. So this says chapter 17, but it should be chapter 21 for you guys. I just don't have the ability to edit it off of the PowerPoint because it's on my office computer. So I'm just viewing this to show you guys today. So how did life originate? Well, for thousands of years in science, it was considered that spontaneous generation was thought to be the source of life, meaning we went from one day there was non-life to life. In 1862, Louis Pasteur, who's a major scientist in the field of science, demonstrated that life did not arise from non-life. So we didn't have something dead and from that came something alive. Okay, so there had to be another process at play. And so he did this by taking non-life things and trying to see if he could recreate early Earth conditions that would ignite non-life to life. Okay, so it means it's not likely to be the route in which life originated. In 1953, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey built a model of what early Earth was thought to be like, and they built it in a chemistry lab. And so you can see they have primitive gases in this bubble on the left. They have the ocean over on the right with a heating source. In the very bottom, they have cooled water that contained organic compounds. So these are like the building blocks for primitive life. We have the building blocks, we have the gases, we have the ocean, all the things that would have been present. And what they did is they ignited it with what would have been like a lightning strike, and they saw that they could form primitive life molecules, if you will, from this type of setup. Okay, so it's a hypothesis. However, there are several that question how accurate this early Earth model was. There are many other theories. Some of them include meteorite bombardment, deep sea environments. So we don't really know a lot about the ocean even now, and so we know very little about it way back when. And so because there's this uncertain involvement of the ocean, what was down in the deep sea environment and what wasn't, we don't really know if that plays a factor or not in the development of primitive life. So when we're talking about primitive life, we're not talking about humans, elephants, things like that. We're talking about microscopic prokaryotes, eukaryotes, bacteria, fungi. We're talking about a small cellular level life. Okay, so what makes this even more difficult is that we don't really understand how primitive life originated. Therefore, we don't really understand how complex organisms originated. It's highly debated, and it's a confusing topic. So, there's, even within the field of Christianity and our idea of where life originated from, we have different theories. There's the young earth and the old earth, and we don't really necessarily agree on which is the right interpretation of Genesis, and scientists don't either. So there's still a lot that we don't quite understand, which is what makes science such a fascinating field. So we have two groups. The first are the heterotrophs. So this is the group in which we are part of. We're the earliest living marine prokaryotes. So this is not us because we are not marine and we have a nucleus. So we are eukaryotes. Prokaryotes were before nucleus. They lived in an oxygen-free environment. So they lived under very harsh conditions. It was very hot, very nasty gases to be breathing in, but they existed. Autotrophs, which are the plants down here on the left, later evolved into organisms that were able to convert inorganic molecules into food and organic molecules. So things like what we eat. Okay, so that's the purpose that plants serve. Eukaryotes, as we know, it developed according to what we think is called the endosymbiotic theory. So we talked about prokaryotes as having no nucleus and eukaryotes as having a nucleus. So what we think might have happened is that a prokaryote was ingested by an aerobic bacteria, something that breathes oxygen. The aerobes were protected by the prokaryote and produced energy for it. Over a long period of time, those bacteria became mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, and they couldn't live on their own anymore. Some of the primitive prokaryotes also ingested what's called cyanobacteria, and the cyanobacteria themselves contain photosynthetic pigments like chloroplast. Over a long period of time, the cyanobacteria in these prokaryotes became chloroplasts and couldn't live on their own anymore. And so this is where we think that eukaryotes might have come from. And it's really just things gobbling other things and surviving. But it is just a theory. It's based on what we believe could have happened or might have happened with what was available. So that's what makes it a theory. But it currently exists as one of the more substantial theories. So where did life diversity that we see come from? Well, there's two theories that kind of, two camps, two opinions. The first one is Lamarck's inheritance of acquired characteristics. So if we're looking at the top image, his view states that the original giraffe may have been a short-necked ancestor. The giraffes have to keep stretching higher and higher and higher to reach the leaves on the tree. And they continue stretching their neck until progressively it becomes longer. And then over time, the descendants of the original giraffe also develop longer necks. Okay, so his is like, I need to eat the leaves. So I'm going to stretch my neck out to be able to reach those leaves on the tree as they get higher and higher. Okay, so it's kind of a competitive market for trees on a leaf. Leaves on a tree. I'm getting that backwards. And I did probably several times, so sorry. Darwin's natural selection is the second group. And so what you see here is the original group had variation in the neck length. So we know that people are varied, giraffes are varied, so it makes sense that we might have a population of giraffes with different lengths of necks. Now, the theory that Darwin held was that natural selection favors longer necks. Because it's a favored characteristic, it's what's more likely to be passed on to the following generation. And over time, what happens is that we see that giraffes' necks have grown from their original ancestor because it was adapted to be a favorable characteristic. So Darwin suggests that things that are favorable to survival are going to be passed on. Okay, so two different camps. So what does natural selection mean? It is when organisms with advantageous traits leave more offspring than organisms with other traits, which over time causes the population to change because you have one group that's being favored, producing more offspring than another group that may not be producing offspring with favorable traits. So if we look here on the left, we have a mixture of bunnies in the desert. We have brown ones and gray ones. And over time, we see that the bunnies have now shifted to where maybe they are tan because the trait that's advantageous here is to blend in with the sand. The brown and the gray bunnies on the left don't blend in with the sand, making them prey for, predators to eat. And on the right, these rabbits blend in with the sand. So they are better blended into their environment, which is what natural selection, the principle of natural selection tells us would happen. So variation is going to be when a population of organisms have individuals that show many traits. Okay, so this is something that I then want you to think about what variation means. Think of some examples. I'll give you one, but you can't use mine. Eye color is a variation. Okay, so come up with at least two more examples of variation that you might see in a population of organisms. Heritability is the genes that are passed from parents to offspring that are ultimately influencing what traits are expressed. So this says what types of traits are inheritable. And so I'll tell you, eye color is inheritable. okay? So I want you to think of at least 3 other inheritable traits, things that are passed down from one generation to another, because not all things are. The way you talk is not, or your, I can't think of the, like whether or not you have a southern, I guess your accent. Your accent is not passed down from one generation to another. Okay, so that's something that's not inherited. Natural selection occurs for certain traits that increase the fitness. And fitness is the number of offspring left behind by an individual. So the more fit you are, the more offspring you'll have. The less fit, the less offspring. So it's not about pumping iron at the gym. It has everything to do with offspring. Which a lot of these don't necessarily directly apply to us because we're a different, or we'll see, well, we're a species that tends to not to have to produce a lot for survival. We're kind of on the other side. We're producing so many that our population is like increasing. But if you think about like rabbits and birds and mice, things like that that have lots of offspring and have them regularly, those are things, these are the kind of groups you want to think about with these terms. So which then will increase the likelihood that the trait will persist in the population. So what are some examples of this? So one of the examples I can think of is male birds tend to be, and I don't know if y'all know this, but tend to have the more colorful feathers. The female bird of that same species will have like really dull colors, like they'll be brown or, you know, black, but not very colorful. And so male birds that have really pretty long, colorful feathers, those are traits that are favored in reproduction. So the female birds will go and find the male bird that has the brightest, best feathers because they want their offspring to be able to compete and then produce. So it's not about them being attracted to the bird, it's about them producing offspring that are then likely to have the same chances of producing and keeping on their survival, that family line, if you will. So think of at least one more example, and you can Google it if you need to, but one more example of natural selection that increases the fitness. All right, adaptation is the evolution of the population to be better adapted to their environment. And this arises from the 3 previous points. Okay, so from natural selection, heritability, and variation. So what are examples of adaptation? Over time we've seen, I have one example, sharks. I don't know if y'all know this or not, but sharks that are normally a saltwater species only are showing the ability to be able to swim further upstream into freshwater. And so they're basically like testing it out. They'll go as far up a stream as they can and then turn around and come back into the salt water. And so what they're doing is they're I don't know if it's because of the water warming up or what, I'm not so sure about why, but I know it is because their fish are not where they normally are, where they're hunting them. And so the sharks are having to come further into the freshwater streams to find food. And so that's one example of adaptation that I know of. And I want you to come up with at least one other example of adaptation. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to come up with lots of examples. Okay, so we've done one here, one on the natural selection, 3 on inheritable traits, and 2 on variation. Okay, so how does natural selection work? Well, here's a visual example of what you might see. So maybe this will help you come up with your own examples. So variation is where you have organisms that show lots of different traits, or have traits that show lots of variation. So in this case, these little beetles, they're different colors. They're tan, red, and green. And if you think about it, the green ones are probably better off, but we don't know that. We just know that they're varied. Heritability is that some traits are heritable and they're determined by genes, and so they're passed on from parents to offspring. So in this image, we see that red beetles have red baby beetles, green beetles have green baby beetles, and yellow beetles have yellow baby beetles. Natural selection is variation in the heritable traits can result in some organisms leaving more offspring than others, and it's called natural selection. So we have these big bird predators coming down, and if you see, the bird predators are picking up the red and the yellow, or maybe I called them tan, I don't remember now, but yellow tannish beetles, but the green ones, because they're so cleverly hidden with the grass, they are surviving. And because they're surviving, they are there presently more to pass on their genes. And adaptation is over time. Eventually, natural selection will cause those advantageous traits to become more common in a population. In this way, the entire population becomes adapted to their environment. And so in the last one, we only have green beetles. Okay? No more red or yellow. All right, so hopefully that image makes sense. The more often an allele, which is a gene, is passed on, the more likely it will be observed. This is the allele frequency. So the more you pass on your genes, the more frequently you're going to see your genes present. Natural selection does not affect the genes directly, so it doesn't change them. Instead, it affects the gene and the allele frequency. So if we're thinking about the variation we see here, we have the brown and green beetles. And if there was, instead of grass, say that these beetles lived in the sand. Well, the green beetles then are not going to be cleverly hidden. It's the brown beetles instead that will be hidden, and the bird is going to consume them. And over time, the brown beetles will predominate over the green ones, but the gene that produces the green or the brown doesn't change. The only thing that's changed here is the frequency at which we see it. So this would make the green beetles more rare than brown beetles. So natural selection isn't the only force acting on evolution. Genetic drift is going to be the evolution of a population just by chance. So in this case, we have blue and purple moths. And let's say that the purple moths just died by chance. They all happened to be in a tree that somebody cut down and sprayed with pesticides, and now they're all gone. Well, then all that's left to reproduce are the are the bluish moths. Okay, so genetic drift is the evolution of a population by chance. Okay, extinction of a species, the removal of a trait, something like that. Another one is called gene flow, which describes the change in allele frequencies that result from a net movement of alleles into or out of the population. So say that a new moth comes in and the moth is green. Well, now because you have a green moth and a blue moth, we're going to see that the frequency in the population of what's expressed is going to be different because we have two different variations. It'd be the same thing as if we went back up to the red, the yellow, and the green beetles. Well, if we got rid of the red beetles and all it was yellow or green, and only the green ones were hidden, the yellow ones would be the most likely preyed upon beetle, meaning that the green one's still going to show faster and naturally adapt over time. So either way, variation is essential for any of these processes to occur. Variation gives populations a chance to adapt to environments, especially when the environments are changing. So variation is very important. So a species is a group of organisms where members can breed with one another, but not with members of other species. So cats and cats, dogs and dogs, birds and birds, that type of thing. In order for a new species, which is known as speciation, to be formed, the reproductive barriers between the two must first be removed. Okay, so cats and dogs, they have a barrier. And in order for that cat-dog, cog or dot, to be a species, there would have to be a removal of a barrier. Okay. So let's talk about some barriers. The first is called allopatric speciation, which is where a new species is formed after a geographic barrier that used to divide them now is removed. So on this one we see that we have species A, and the barriers keeping the rabbits apart. And on the right hand side, the species, it is a cold species, and on the left it is a warm area. But say the barrier is removed, and now, it says now the barrier is going to be keeping them apart. So in this case, the image is the opposite. We're putting in a barrier, and that barrier over time means that the rabbits on the right are going to adapt to a cold environment, which is snowy, and they'll become snow bunnies. And the rabbits on the left become, just regular old cottontails because they don't need to blend in with snow. They need to blend in with trees and grass and shrubs. And so the opposite could happen if the barrier is removed. Two species could form, or two species could come together and form a new species if the snow bunny and the cottontail came together to form the species A. So geographic barrier is kind of the first one. So sympatric speciation occurs without geographic isolation. So much more rare and usually occurs because of improper meiosis. So this is things like, cats and dogs don't have animals or don't have offspring, and birds and dogs don't have offspring. Okay. And so can result from hybridization, which is when two species interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. So the example I can think of here is, and I might get this backwards, but when you have a mule, M-U-L-E, a mule is going to be a species that cannot reproduce. So mules don't reproduce with each other. And a mule comes from the offspring of a donkey and a female horse, okay? And so because they come out and they're sterile, you don't have mules making more mules. It's always going to be between a male donkey and a female horse. But hybridization is way more common in plants than in animals. So it's really easy to hybridize like daylilies, pine trees, things like that, because they don't have as much of a barrier because they don't go through some of the same processes that we do. So here's an example of allopatric speciation. You have the trees on the left, canyon forms between them. The trees on the left become stay one species. The trees on the right become a new species. And then you have sympatric speciation. So say here in this image, you have no sort of barrier, but all of a sudden a new type of pine tree crops up in the middle of a forest. And so sometimes it's a good thing. There's no negative impact on the environment, but sometimes it's a bad thing because they could be invasive. So let's talk about some evidence for evolution. Evolution is kind of a tisk word in some places. Some people really don't like the word evolution. But I want you to think of evolution as not being centered around humans, because I don't really think that that's the point of teaching evolution. I really think that we need to think about it more as adaptation. How do we adapt to our environment? How do animals adapt? How do trees adapt? How are we adapting to these changes? And as we're living in a time, in a day and age where climate change is a very real thing that we're seeing, we're going to see adaptation happening a lot faster than what we've normally seen. So what's some evidence that we see? The first is observation of natural selection in action. So we can literally observe red beetles being taken away faster than green beetles. Okay, so it's something that we can see. It doesn't take a long time to visualize those changes. The second is artificial selection. So the selective breeding of organisms with the desirable traits to produce offspring with desirable traits. So designer dogs, designer cats, designer horses. Designer cows. We know how to manipulate the genetics, and we can see it produces often what we're trying to produce, which is artificial selection. The third is similarities in body structure. So this is across species. There are, of course, differences. Cows have 4 stomachs, we have 1. But the general idea is that the body systems overall organized are very similar. And we have a mouth. We don't all have butts, but we mainly have some sort of excretory system. We usually all breathe in somehow, whether it's through gills or, a mouth and an esophagus. Eyes, ears, things to help us move about, locomotive. So there are some similarities. The fourth is vestigial organs. So for us, this would be something like pinky toes, our tailbone, your appendix, wisdom teeth. So things that are, which I know the wisdom teeth are not an organ, but it's an example of something that's no longer necessary. So vestigial organs are things that we have that don't serve a purpose. They're because we used to, when we had, a tail or pinky toes for when we needed to do, we were not wearing shoes everywhere, or wisdom teeth when we had more of a plant-based diet. An appendix, I don't really remember what the appendix purpose served, but I think it had something to do with the dietary. DNA and molecular evidence. So in 1995, I think, is when we cracked the DNA code, sequence DNA. And since then, we've been able to study genetic sequences of all kinds of animals and compare similarities. And we do know that even though we look very different, most of us are 99.9999999% the same, and it's a very little small fraction that makes us unique, which is beautiful. I mean, that's exactly the purpose, is that we are fundamentally the same. It's very little that makes us different. Same thing with primates. We are very similar, genetically speaking, to primates, meaning it suggests that there's some sort of commonality between us, whether or not we can see it or not. Patterns of development, so going from embryo to babe to teenager to adult to old. I mean, most species go through this, especially mammals. We see whether or not they develop in an egg and then hatch, or they're birthed live like we are. We all tend to go through the same similar cycle of development, either as an embryo or as a living species. The hierarchical organization of living things, so this is called phylogeny, and so we're going to learn more about this, but it's kind of how things are classified: bacteria, mammals, reptiles. We see that we do have a lot of things in common, which gives us a greater hierarchy of organization, which is significant. And then biogeography, so seeing certain species adapt to certain environments that wouldn't survive anywhere else, or finding species on separate continents that may have at one point been connected through Pangea. So provides some idea, it's not likely that bears swim across the ocean. So if you find one bear on one continent and a very similar bear on another continent, it suggests that at one point they probably shared the same land, and some sort of barrier produced either the movement of plates or something else, but a barrier came up which then separated them, and maybe they diversified, but they're still the same. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful lecture to you, and you got your notes filled out, and hopefully it wasn't too long. And then we'll move on to chapter 22 in the next lecture.